Okay, now this new picture emerged with new rules of the game, which changed after the 1961 Constitution. So 1924 was one party plus majoritarian parliamentary system. Which produced a two-party format and a predominant party through majoritarian elections. Election rules. In 1961, not only the Constitution, but also the election system changed, which incorporated, again, large electoral districts, which did not change from 1924 onwards in Turkey. Always large electoral systems, large electoral districts with a large number of seats, which we technically call multi-member districts. So multi-member districts where you have multiple seats to be filled by those who contested those seats through party list voting. So party list voting continued as a practice, so did multi-member districts, multiple seats and party lists contested. But now the rules of the game changed because of proportional representation, which incorporated D'Hondt's largest average formula. For a while, until the 1965 elections, there was a national remainder formula that was also included in the calculations, where these votes not taken into calculation, into perspective in calculating the distribution of votes to seats in the multi-member districts were pooled nationally and then ranked in descending order from the largest to the smallest, and starting from the top was distributed between political parties that corresponded to these national pool of votes, which enabled smaller political parties to receive more seats until 1965. After 1965, the Grand National Assembly changed the law and therefore abolished this national pool known as Milli Bakiye, or national remainder. Therefore, it only survived for two elections, 61 and 65, and then in 1969 it was strictly largest average formula of D'Hondt, which was a simple division of the votes by 1, 2, 3, and 4, as many times as were needed for these seats per electoral district in multi-member districts to be filled. And that really produced a relatively proportionate distribution between the votes and the seats. As you can see here, for example, in the 1965 elections, the newly established Justice Party, which emerged as the front runner in the 1965 elections, as the party that inherited the Democrat Party legacy. In 1961, the Democrat Party was closed down because they had not met the convention of the party in 1959 for 1 whole year, and the lawyer took this up as a case in a district court in Bakırköy and argued that it was a violation of the Associations Act, Dernekler Kanunu of Turkey, and there was no Political Parties Act until 1964 in Turkey and came into operation in 1965. And therefore, all political parties had to be considered as political associations according to the regulations of associations. And there is an Associations Act, or there was an Associations Act in 1950s, which regulated the affairs of the political parties as well as other associations. According to this law, it was necessary and imperative that all associations had 1 convention per annum every year. And Democrat Party had missed that chance, and therefore it could not be considered as operating within the law by 1960. And this court decided that this political party, having violated the Associations Act, was null and void and closed it down. In 1961, several new parties came into being, which had not existed earlier. Justice Party was one of them. And so was the New Turkey Party, Yeni Türkiye Partisi. And it wasn't certain whether the New Turkey Party or the Justice Party, Adalet Partisi, AP, would become the new powerhouse of the right and would be tracking down the same road as the Democrats after 1961. Therefore, in this state of confusion, the vote was split between these 2 political parties, as you can easily see. One got about 35%, the other about 14%. So the 2 put together about 50%, which was more or less the kind of vote that the Democrats were getting in 1950s. But by 1965, it was clear that the new party, to become the powerhouse of the right and track the road that Democrats had been tracking, was Justice Party. It now has a new leader. Formerly, its first leader was a retired general, and that contributed to the confusion of the voters, whether this general could be reliable as being the voice of the periphery. However, this time, he passed away, and there was another major convention in 1964 of the party. And this time, a young bureaucrat, a very successful bureaucrat who came from very humble backgrounds, from İslamköy of Sparta, actually grew up as a shepherd boy and had photos shot of him as a shepherd boy, which was circulated. And he was called for a while Çoban Sülü because of that reason. Shepherd boy Süleyman or Sülü, sort of a short way of referring to him. And that made his credibility boosted as opposed to the New Turkey Party big shots. And he had graduated from Istanbul Technical University's Civil Engineering Department and had his master's degree in the United States. Therefore, it was a stellar rise from enormously humble backgrounds, from a peasant boy to the head of the state waterworks, Devlet Su İşleri, a hydraulics engineer who had part of his studies in the United States, could speak English, and therefore projected both a modern image and a conservative image, which became a very successful symbolism to attract huge number of votes. And in fact, the vote share of the Justice Party went over 50% in spite of the fact that there was this proportional representation formula in practice, not because of majoritarianism under these circumstances. So the vote was split across a variety of political parties. a Turkish Workers' Party, a socialist party, came into life for the first time and was able to get 3% of the vote. New Turkey Party got some of the vote. And the former Nation Party, very nationalistic, ethnic Turkish nationalistic party of the 50s, had become a new party under a new title, Cumhuriyetçi Köylü Millet Partisi, a Republicanist Peasant Nation Party, a tongue twister, actually, was able to get about only 2% of the vote. So Justice Party was very successful in mobilizing the voters to support that party as opposed to the others. And under that system, Turkey moved away from two-partyism to multi-partyism, with multiple political parties gaining seats in the Grand National Assembly, and the spectrum of ideas represented in the Grand National Assembly also increased tremendously, from left of left to right of right, so to speak. Ethnic nationalistic Turks on the one side, non-nationalistic socialists on the other. And of course, the Grand National Assembly became a more raucous place, and the floor debates became much more interesting to watch. But it was in this era that Turkey was also able to increase the kind of effectiveness of the Grand National Assembly debates. Political communication came under the influence of the Grand National Assembly debates, and it was for the first time that the debates became more focused on major domestic and international issues, such as Turkey's relations with NATO, Turkey's relations with the US, President Johnson's letter to İsmet İnönü, due to the recurring Cyprus crisis, in which Turkey started to use some military hardware, which Johnson reminded Prime Minister İnönü at the time that these hardware were donated to Turkey by the Congress, were American weapons to be used in NATO warfare, not in other international squabbles of Turkey, meaning Cyprus. And this, of course, had created considerable amount of reaction from the socialists, and they started to argue that Turkey is now becoming more or less a colony of the United States, and acting as if US was a mandate power and was reacting to us heavily. And also it was the socialists who brought up the issue of the nuclear weapons on Turkish soil, which Turkey had not known about, and it wasn't registered properly. It was in the debates between Khrushchev and Kennedy during the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1960s that these missiles had emerged as part of the debate. And the Soviets demanded that US remove nuclear weapons from Turkey in response to them removing nuclear weapons from Cuban soil. And it looks as if the Kennedy administration agreed to this. And all of this had happened without the knowledge of Turkey, which further indicated that Turkey had been slighted by the Americans in the NATO relationship. And it created an image that Turkey was mistreated by the Americans, and NATO was a foreign force, some kind of an imposition upon Turkey. And therefore, the socialists started to argue that Turkish relations with NATO and the US are not acceptable, and they are almost as colonial relationships. Therefore, this opening up of this debate enhanced the breadth, width, and of course, the character of the very debates that the Grand National Assembly was experiencing. And furthermore, under these circumstances, it became, interestingly, varied on many issues as these different political parties got into the act as such, and also domestic issues, such as rights of labor, labor organizations, labor unions came into the picture. It was in 1963, under the coalition governments, in which the Republican People's Party played some role, that another young politician, almost same age as Süleyman Demirel, who became the leader of the Justice Party, as I told you, in 1964, emerged in the ranks of the Republican People's Party in the Grand National Assembly, Bülent Ecevit. He functioned as the Minister of Labor, and played a major role in promulgating a new law which provided new life to trade unions, which had been quite dormant and not very effective. From 1963 up until they were closed down by the military government of 1980s, for a period of 17, 18 years, they became effective forces of Turkish society, economy, and politics. Not necessarily always liked by all, especially abhorred by business communities because of their rowdiness, and some left-wing trade unions being considered as a dysfunctional force disrupting the process of manufacturing, and therefore they were considered as being most strike-prone, creating a lot of loss of labor days, and downgrading the possibilities of rapid economic growth for Turkey in the eyes of the right-wing, more conservative, or even to a certain extent, liberal politicians, and also businessmen and women of the country. However, in the eyes of the people at large, and also of the left wing, Bülent Ecevit became a hero who produced these new realities and also provided new rights for these people who were employed as laborers in Turkish society. And he became the champion of labor. In a short while, in the 1970s, he would be catapulted in the position of becoming the leader of the Republican People's Party as sort of a champion of all the downtrodden in Turkey. And he would get the title of populist Ecevit, halkçı Ecevit. And his attire, this dark blue shirt, and his cap would become sort of a new fad among younger people in the Turkish society at the time. So in 1964, on the other side of the spectrum, emerged Süleyman Demirel as the leader of the Justice Party. And these two emerged as the commanders of the two major battling parties, Justice Party and the Republican People's Party, until 1980. And also in the 1990s, to a certain extent. Bülent Ecevit has passed away in 2006, if I'm not mistaken. And Süleyman Demirel served until 2000 as the president of the country between 1993 and 2000, and is now experiencing a retirement. But he is still alive and occasionally gets the limelight of the media in Turkey, but not effectively involved in the routine daily politics of the country any longer. So these developments, produced by a change of conversion of the votes to seats from majoritarian to proportional representation, different kinds of it, enabled smaller political parties to gain a foothold and become more influential in the politics of the country, especially after the 70s. As you can see, in the 70s, the number of political parties increased rapidly to effectively about 5 or 6 political parties serving in the Grand National Assembly. And of course, as the early 60s, such a distribution of the seats in the Grand National Assembly required some kind of coalitions to be established. And Turkey, with multipartyism, with about 5 to 6 political parties that are effectively involved in coalition politics, began to experience a party system that veered away from predominance of a right-wing political party of the sort of the Democrat or the Justice Party type to one in which there were many combinations of coalitions due to the newly emerging political parties in this period. Two of them, the Nationalist Action Party, which took over from the Republicanist Peasant Nation Party in 1965 and became a powerhouse of the Turkish ethnic nationalists and the anti-communist forces, and also gained some kind of dimensions which brought upon racism at the time, and the left, accused of being a fascist party, emerged on the one hand, and also soon after, in 1969, the National Order Party, Milli Nizam Partisi, emerged, which was closed down immediately as being a highly religious party in contravention of the Political Parties Act that had come into practice in 1965, which banned communist parties, fascist parties, and Islamist parties, or Şeriatçı Party in Turkey. Those political parties which were propagating re-establishment of Sharia law in Turkey. So these three political parties, when they emerged, were prosecuted and closed down by the Constitutional Court. So the National Milli Nizam Partisi, National Order Party, was closed down in 1969. And after the coup of 1971, according to his account, the leader of the National Salvation Party, MSP, Milli Selamet Partisi, Milli Selamet is National Salvation. National Salvation Party was invited by the military from Switzerland, back from Switzerland, to establish this new political party during the coup period of 1971 through 1973, and that participated in the elections in 1973. The leader of the MSP is a professor of mechanical law, mechanical engineering at Istanbul Technical University. He had been employed in Germany for a while after the Second World War and worked on the development of the engines of the Leopard tank in Germany. And he had been a professor of mechanical engineering at Istanbul Technical University when he decided to join in the fray of politics and take part in the political party politics of Turkey. Professor Erbakan established the National Salvation Party and got into the picture in the 1973 elections, and the party got about 12% of the vote, which was almost the same as the Democratic Party. It's not Democrat Party, it's Democratic Party in Turkish. Also, that's why I symbolize it with DEMP, which split from the Justice Party and more closely associated with rural interests and the burgeoning industrialism in Anatolia, the first instance of Anatolian lions showing their teeth, split from the Justice Party, which was more oriented towards bigger business and more urban and more industrial in orientation, although had strong agricultural connections and peasant ties by 1970s. So this split enabled the Republican People's Party, just like in 1961, to emerge as the party with the plurality of the vote, but only with about 33%. 1 out of 3 voters who participated in the elections voted for the Republican People's Party. So under these circumstances, some kind of a coalition was necessary, and the Republican People's Party chose to have coalition with the MSP. Now, this was a rather interesting idea, for the National Salvation Party was against the established order of the Turkish Republic at the time, because they were objecting to the secular or laicist policies of the state. Whereas the Republican People's Party was the party that had established those laicist practices, supporting them, upholding them, and had no problems with them, but they were also opposing the crony capitalist system of Turkey at the time, which the National Salvation Party was also opposing. It was also suggesting a different kind of economic organization instead of capitalism. So a sort of a Republican People's Party now developing into something like a left of center party, as they had already declared in the 1965 elections from the mouth of İsmet İnönü himself. This party was looking more like a social democratic party developing in Turkey, joining forces with the political Islamist party to sort of create a revolution by increment through democracy, which of course didn't fly as an idea, and it ran into grave problems soon after it was established. First of all, of course, there was the major oil shock that Turkey had to cope with. In October 1973, unexpectedly and rather successfully, Egypt attacked Israel. Crossing over the Suez Canal, they were able to defeat the first couple of defenses of Israel in the Sinai, and Israel was able to recoup and hit back. There was something like an impasse, and this is known as the Yom Kippur War of 1973. The major powers of the world intervened, and they were able to establish a process which culminated in the Camp David Agreement between Egypt and Israel eventually, and established a new balance between those two countries and some kind of a peace between those countries by 1977. But in the meantime, for the first time, oil-producing countries were able to come together and establish what the economists call a cartel, who would negotiate production, processes, quantities, and of course, that dictates the price of oil. The price of oil skyrocketed in a very short period of time as they imposed an embargo on Israel and those countries that supported Israel in this war. And the oil prices began to become a major worry for the Turkish governments as of 1973. Turkish exports at the time was about $700 to $800 million. Suddenly, by 1974-75, the oil price that Turkey had to import from abroad rose up to $3 billion, approximately 4 times the entire exports of the country. And that's a huge trade deficit, which Turkey had difficulty financing. That was the first shock the coalition government of CHP, MSP experienced. Second came from the Greek junta. Greek colonels had taken over the helm of government in 1967 and had been running the show in Greece since then. Major politicians had fled the country. Most important of them all, Mr. Karamanlis, was in Paris, France. By the mid-70s, 1973-74, they started to feel the downturn of the economic growth in Greece and the increasing amount of complaint and disgruntlement against their government. And in the meantime, in Cyprus, there was a working democracy by the Cypriots who lived in the south of the island right now, but at the time were mingled with the Turkish community, And they had elected as their leader, through due process, Archbishop Makarios. So there's this elected government of Cyprus, and he was speaking the language of democracy. And that was falling onto eager ears on the mainland of Greece. And this was creating greater amount of dissatisfaction with the junta. And junta had to do something to save the day and change this mood. So they calculated that if they could pull a trick by sending loyal people over to the island of Cyprus, support them by the Greek military, carry out a coup, capture Makarios or kill him perhaps in this process, and get rid of him. And this way, the main opposition, the main voice of opposition would be muted against them. And in this fait accompli, they will be perceived as national heroes of Greece as they establish union with the island of Cyprus, enosis, which had been a long-term foreign policy option for the Greek government of the colonels anyway. So they carried out a coup on the island of Cyprus in 1974. However, Archbishop Makarios had some luck or divine connections, I don't know, knew about this coup coming, calculated it, fled the island, went all the way to New York, to the United Nations, and declared that this coup was illegal, illegitimate, and that the Greek colonels be punished by the UN as well. And this produced a new situation for this new coalition, and they had to do something about it by June 1974. That was the second crisis that they had to face. And this was a political crisis, not an economic one. In 1959 and 60, 2 accords had been signed between Turkey, Greece, and Britain. Britain being the mandate power over Cyprus, which had become its dominion in 1870s. By the Russo-Turkish War, Britain had intervened on the part of the Ottoman Empire in that war, and in return for which it had received its domination over the island of Cyprus. And after the First World War, and during the First World War, that island was considered as part of the British Commonwealth. And in the 50s, due to increasing demands for independence coming from especially the Greek community on the island first, and then the Turkish community joining them in 1956, the British decided to establish some kind of negotiation between Turkey, Britain, and Greece so as to redefine the status of that island, which by 1960 had its own constitution and independence recognized, but under the guarantorship of 3 states, Britain, Greece, and Turkey. Now that that constitution was at peril because of a military intervention by Greece, Turkey assumed that the circumstances of political instability required the intervention of the guarantors to establish the status quo ante, the state of things as they had existed before the coup. Greece was in no position to provide such an help, but Turkish government was not able to persuade the Labour government of Britain under Prime Minister Callaghan to intervene militarily with Turkey jointly to re-establish the democratic procedures as written into the Constitution of the Republic of Cyprus in 1960, after the coup of 1974. With that being not accomplished, Turkish government decided to intervene on the island of Cyprus by military means at the end of June 1974. Now that intervention created a new situation on the island. Turkey explained its position in the United Nations, and it was accepted that as a guarantor power, it had the right to reestablish the democratic system or the constitutional order of Cyprus. However, this move led to the toppling of the Greek kernels in Greece, and the politicians who had played a major role in managing the democracy of Greece started to resurface. Mr. Karamanlis flew from Paris, France, back to Athens and started to resume authority in the mainland Greece, and as a result of which the situation started to change rapidly by summer of 1974. Turkey then started negotiations with Greece and Britain in Geneva. However, those negotiations in the eyes of the Turkish diplomats were not going anywhere, and the Turkish troops that had landed on the island in the June-July intervention did not necessarily were able to control a large swath of land to provide protection for the Turkish community on the island, and they were getting reports that the Turks on the island were being slaughtered by the Greek forces that had landed and carried out the military coup. And discovering that these negotiations in Geneva will last a very long period of time, the Turkish government decided to have a second intervention in August 1974, which was declared as illegal by the United Nations. Not the first one, but the second one. And as a result of that, Turkish troops controlled about 40% of the northern part of Ireland and invited the Turkish communities to the south of that line to go north and settle there. And they have. And it has created the current situation on Cyprus by 1974. Now, this was considered as a violation of the Accords of 1959 and 1960, by Britain included, and resulted in various sanctions imposed upon Turkey by UN, to which some European countries participated. And within a year or so in 1975, Turkey was faced with another embargo, another set of sanctions in the form of an arms embargo by the United States. Now, these also created a greater need for importation of needed material, defense material, from other sources, and that strained the hard currency reserves of the central bank even further. And Turkey started to experience a pressure for devaluation of the Turkish lira and loss of purchasing power in the Turkish lira and an increasing inflation, and the economy didn't seem to look so good. But in the meantime, Bülent Ecevit, the prime minister of this coalition government and the leader of the Republican People's Party, had evidence that he had enormous amount of popularity in the country. Polls were new, but some polls taken indicated that about 80% of the people supported him, and the Republican People's Party could get a huge boost in the polls if they went for early elections. So the Republican People's Party decided to get out of this deal and go for early elections and refuse the deal offered by the Democratic Party at the time. If you look at the vote shares and the seat shares of the Democratic Party and the MSP, they're very similar. They could have easily established such a relationship with the Democratic Party. However, they decided that to be able to reestablish party government instead of coalition government and get rid of these nasty relationships with far-right political parties looked so palatable, and the outcome of the elections looked so certain that the Republican People's Party decided wrongly that they could call for an early election and would get enough support from others who would deliver them an electoral victory in the elections. Not so. MSP got into negotiations with the Justice Party and MHP, and the three of them were able to establish a coalition in early 1975. So from 1975 to 1977, Turkey was ruled by these three political parties in coalition, which was popularly referred to as the National Front operation, or National Front government, Milli Cephe Hükümeti as it was called, because it was a highly nationalist, highly religious, right-wing conservative coalition of some sort of the time. And these three political parties had gotten into a big conflict with the Republican People's Party, and the relationship in the country deteriorated into something like a civil war situation by 1977. And the 1977 elections failed to produce what the Republican People's Party had been yearning for or expecting or anticipating earlier. They were only able to get about 41% of the vote. Some argue that there was blatant vote rigging during the elections. There have been power outages, which had been going on in the country because of the shortage of fuel for energy terminals in the country, and therefore power outages were something regular. But these were occurring in places where the results seemed to be indicating that the Republican People's Party was winning the election, so they had assumed that there was a conspiracy to hold them down to about 40%, although they had received more of the vote during the election. We'll never know. This is the official result that was tallied by the Election Commission, and as a result of which the country moved on to a new period of coalition government politics. However, after the 1977 elections, the National Front government could not be reestablished with the same kind of force, and therefore there was a period of uncertainty until the end of 1977. On the 1st of January 1978, a new government was established by the Republican People's Party by means of engaging 11 people who deserted from the ranks of the Justice Party and got into this coalition deal of some sort, not of the Justice Party, but of 11 members of the former members of the Justice Party who received, most of who received ministerial positions in the new cabinet. And the negotiations for that had taken place in a small motel in Ankara known as the Güneş Motel. And the opposition from then on, that is the Justice Party mainly, but the others also considered this as an unethical way of undermining the National Front government and establishing a corrupt coalition of sorts with 11 people. Instead of just having a coalition between two political parties, it was argued that it was a Republican People's Party in coalition with 11 parties, almost, each member acting as if he were a party by his own merits. And the situation became not any better. Those who were killed by terror attacks in the country increased, and major clashes between Sunni and Alevi populations in Kahramanmaraş, Çorum, Sivas, Erzincan started to take place, where large ethnic cleansing started to occur in the country, and the death toll increased. In 1979, November, Senate by-elections in 5 provinces delivered a huge victory for the Republican People's Party, for the Justice Party, to the detriment of the Republican People's Party. Soon after those elections, the Republican People's Party quit the government, resigned, and Justice Party got back onto the government, and Mr. Süleyman Demirel became the prime minister again until the coup on the 12th of September 1980. He ruled as the leader of a minority government supported in the Grand National Assembly by the former coalition partners MHP and MSP, although their support was precarious, to say the least. This was a time, if you read the papers, you will see many references made by Professor Erbakan of calculating the time to pull the rug from underneath the feet of Süleyman Demirel, and he said that he was waiting for the opportune time. And he made a reference to a sort of culinary practice, waiting for the bottom side of the kadayıf to get reddish. Kadayıfın kızarmasını bekliyorum. And this argument continued for a very, very long time, about 6 months or so, and it wasn't certain that MSP would be defending these positions. But this was a very interesting period because by that time, the economy had been in tatters. Turkey was running short on everything. And in response to a question asked to Süleyman Demirel about finding $70 million or no, he said that Turkey is in need of 70 cents, that the foreign reserves were completely decimated by that time. So under those circumstances, it looked as if there was no other option but to go for liberal market economy practices. And by a decree of the government, with the force of law, not going through the Grand National Assembly, by executive fiat, Turkey declared an end to any kind of regulation in the markets, free market practices, liberalizing the price controls, and Turkey changed its economic system from import substitution to liberal market economy on the 24th of January 1980, 34 years ago. And that is known as the turning point for the economy, and a decision taken by Prime Minister Demirel's cabinet. However, the press especially gave more credit to Turgut Özal, who was the undersecretary of the Prime Ministry, arguing that he was instrumental in convincing the government, especially Süleyman Demirel, to take this step. Well, as you very well know, although undersecretaries are relatively powerful people, in Turkey it's the prime ministers who take the blame or credit for doing these sorts of things, as far as I'm concerned. So I consider this as the decision of Süleyman Demirel's government, and he should be accorded with the credit or debit of this decision. However, it helped to boost the image of Turgut Özal tremendously, which enabled him to become the minister in charge of the economy under the military coup government of Bülent Ulusu, and stayed in power as the minister in charge of the economy until 1983. When it became apparent that Turkey was going to go back to multi-party politics, he resigned from government, established the Motherland Party in May 1983, and went into politics, or back into politics, for he had run in 1977 as a deputy or a candidate for a deputy of the National Salvation Party from Izmir, and had lost the election. And he had not been serving in the Grand National Assembly, which enabled him to get into the coalition government, and then, after the coalition government, become the new prime minister. So his career came from this political Islamist background also. And the military had seen no problem in working with him, asking him to be in charge of the economy after the military coup, for he had served as the top bureaucrat in the economic circles of central government as the director of the state planning organization for a long time before he had become the undersecretary of the prime ministry, which is another indication that the military did not seem to be paying too much attention to political Islamist backgrounds of many people that they were working with, and they were not following a very ideological position of defending or resurrecting Kemalism under any garb in 1980s, as the popular propaganda in Turkey goes. This is another evidence which casts some doubt in this kind of perspective. That is a too simplistic a story to tell you the truth. The reality is much more complicated than that. So this period brought the end of this era with the 1961 Constitution. From 1983 onwards, Turkey had a new constitution and new election law and a new Political Parties Act, which came into effect. And this time, Turkey continued with multi-member districts. List ballots or list voting. Party list ballots, actually. That people continued on voting for party lists in relatively large electoral districts with multiple seats. Don't formula was preserved. The same largest average PR formula continued as the practice, but with a 10% national threshold now. As some of you may know, this is the highest threshold in Europe for any election law. And the second to it is Russia with 7%, which is not necessarily very high on the democracy index either. Then come a host of countries with about 5% national thresholds. However, these are not ironclad 5% thresholds as 10% threshold is in Turkey. For where they're applied, for example, in Germany, there are also single-member districts, and political parties that get 3 of these seats can go around the 5% threshold. Therefore, it's not implemented in an ironclad fashion. And therefore, small minorities concentrated in certain areas are not ignored or suppressed. Whereas in Turkey, one of the largest minorities, the Kurdish nationalists, have been constantly suppressed, and they had to find new ways of going around the 10% threshold. And that makes the application of 10% threshold, again, not necessarily in full agreement with democracy. And they have been objecting to it from the very beginning onwards. And they actually took this issue to the Turkish courts. They were not able to get anywhere, took it all the way to the European Court of Human Rights, and European Court of Human Rights decided that 10% is a steep threshold. However, there are 2 goals in any election law. One is representativeness, and the other is accountability. And they are irreconcilable. Marrying the 2 is difficult. When you have more representation, as we have seen and as we can see here, the more political parties you get. Party system becomes fragmented, and you have more political parties in the party system vying for seats in the Grand National Assembly, and the Grand National Assembly has a parliamentary party system which is also fragmented and causes difficulty in establishing and running coalition governments. And therefore, accountability becomes a difficult matter. Who is to be held accountable for whatever happens because of a certain economic policy that doesn't produce the fruits or the kinds of promises that the political parties who established the coalition made in their campaign? Whereas when you have accountability as the basic norm, for example, in the case of the British or the American system, where you have single-member districts, plurality wins, the one who gets the most votes win that seat. You know who to blame after the elections. It's usually one political party that wins the election, and that political party follows a certain policy. If that doesn't work, then you kick out those who are in charge and bring in the opposition. Therefore, defining the accountability for what happens becomes less and less problematic. However, representativeness is very low under those circumstances in the British case. So under these circumstances, the court decided that Turkey vied for accountability. in a way that perhaps was not something that needs to be recommended to other countries in Europe, but it was good enough for Turkey. If you read the wording of this decision, the judges seem to be arguing that, well, considering the Turkish situation, this is one way of establishing accountability. And they, of course, have declared, indeed, the Turkish constitutional Article 67 is not in conformity with the Turkish electoral law. They didn't make such a comment, but we can make that comment, because that law, that article argues that the two goals of representativeness and accountability need to be met, somehow compromised in the election laws. The decision of the European Court of Human Rights was very clear. There was no such compromise. It was indeed accountability that is adopted as the basic principle, not representativeness. Therefore, they declared by their decision that Article 67 was being violated by the electoral law in Turkey. However, no action took place on that matter. Although I have been voicing this over the years, many occasions, falls on deaf ears, because of what happened afterwards. 10% helps those who come to power. And they believe that thanks to 10%, they can stay in power, hold on to their seats, especially if they can somehow work out a formula that can satisfy the people. And I've shown you the formula that satisfies the people. A perception that the economy is well managed, plus to be on the correct ideological side, providing cultural and pecuniary benefits to the largest block of the Turkish voters, the lumpen proletariat, produces a winning formula for the Justice and Development Party, finally, after 2002. So there is no reason why that political party should change the election laws now, and get rid of the 10%. And this 10% argument is still pushed by the Kurdish nationalists, who are kept out of the game as a political party, and the only way they can get in is to field candidates as independents. Once they get elected, they can then, in the Grand National Assembly, if there are more than 20 of them, in the last election, 2011, there were 35 of them, they could establish a parliamentary party group, and the parliamentary party groups in the Grand National Assembly increases to 4 by default. But this is a lot of sort of bypassing, zigzagging, meandering about the laws. Also, they have been complaining that the independents' names do not appear in legible format on most ballots. Although party emblems and names are very legible, they use different fonts for the independent candidates so that people don't vote for them. So there is a little bit of unfairness in all of this as well, in their arguments being made. So under these circumstances, 10% is a threshold that poisons the relations between the political parties across the board as such. However, once they win the election, they get disinterested in changing the 10%. In fact, in 1991 elections, before they were going for it, the True Path Party, under the leadership of Süleyman Demirel, made a campaign promise. They will scrap this 10% threshold once they come to power. They did come to power in coalition with the Republican People's Party. They had also pledged to get rid of the 10%. They did nothing about it. We made this point on many occasions. In fact, I was involved in a project by the prodding of the Speaker of the Grand National Assembly, Hüsamettin Cindoruk, at the time, who argued that we have not provided them with an alternative as academics. So myself and a colleague who passed away, unfortunately, at a very young age, Murat Sertel, sat down together and got some funding from the business community in Turkey, TÜSİAD, and suggested a new election law for Turkey. We presented it to the Grand National Assembly. They said, oh, well, this is too complicated. We don't want it. Go for something simple. You know, why not? They're not interested. They have never been interested, and in fact, they see this as one of the greatest attacks on their government when they come to power. Not only the Justice and Development Party, all of the political parties. And they believe that 10% is a big shield that keeps them in power and helps them to rule in the way that they do. As a result of that, we have this high barrage don't system now operating in Turkey. For a while, it created party government in 1983 and 87 elections. In this period, the older political parties were banned in 1982 by the military government. All of them were closed down this time. In 1960, they had only closed down the Democrat Party. This time, they closed all of them, including the Republican People's Party. And they were not able to stand against this decision and fight it, except for Bülent Ecevit. One single person alone fought against the military. He was put behind the bars because of that. And he was the only one who tried to stand the ground. Republican People's Party, the rest of them did not. He severed all his ties with them and never got back into the fold of the Social Democratic Party afterwards. And that was the last straw that broke the relationship between Bülent Ecevit and the rest of the Republican People's Party. After 1982, they were also banned from politics. The older politicians, those who had played a major role in the governments of the 1970s, were banned from 5 years to 10 years from politics. The top leaders, such as Mr. Demirel or Mr. Ecevit, were banned for 10 years. Now, there was a big push by the media, public opinion in 1986 to reintroduce these people back into politics of the country. And Turkey held a referendum on political rights of these people. A weird referendum. And decided by 50.2% of the vote in favor of reinstalling the older politicians into the multi-party politics of Turkey. So they entered the fray in 1987. And after 1987, we observed that the number of political parties increased. New political parties were established in this process. All the ones were closed down. As you can see, CHP had not participated in the elections between 1983 and 1995. It's absent. In its place was SHP, Social Democratic Populist Party, which was established, Social Democratic Party, in 1983, banned by the military, and they did not permit that party to enter the elections in 1983. 1983 elections were neither free nor fair, just like the 1946 elections. In these elections, only 3 political parties were permitted to get into the competition: Populist Party, Nationalist Democracy Party, and the Motherland Party, established by Özal. The military was not able to close down Özal's party, and was the only genuine party that was established. The other 2 were established by the military as the government party, Nationalist Democracy Party, and as the loyal opposition party, Halkçı Party, Populist Party. Instead of CHP, now it'll be HP, going back to the roots, so to speak. However, the calculations did not hold. People voted for the Motherland Party, for the more civilian-looking party of Özal. Özal had his own very good, immaculate relations with the military, as I've tried to tell you. So he was not a full civilian opposition to the military rule. And that made them work with the military between 1983 and 1989, when the military was still in power, more or less. Not in full, but through the president's office, which was controlled by Kenan Evren, who was elected in 1982 with the Constitution to be the first president of the country after 1982 for a 7-year period, single term, non-renewable. And he stayed for the full length until 1989. And that period was a sort of a quasi-military government, with Motherland Party at the helm of civilian government, with Mr. Özal functioning as the prime minister of the Motherland Party. Now, in this period, eventually in 1987, with new political parties established on the left and right, SHP on the left, DYP on the right, other than the Motherland Party. And these two political parties established by the military closed themselves down in a very short period of time, discovering that they were going nowhere under these circumstances. DYP became the new party of Demirel. Indeed, those are the acronyms. You know, in Turkish, or Doğru Yol Partisi. So it was relatively easy to remember. The new party of Demirel, Demirel'in yeni partisi, or Doğru Yol Partisi. Doğru Yol also had this highly religious connotation. It comes from a concept used in the Holy Quran, Sirat al-Mustaqim, which means straight path, although it's translated into English as true path, and our Arab colleagues say, you know nothing about Arabic, that's why you cannot translate it properly, etc. all this time. It's the straight path, and there is a saying in Turkish, Allah doğru yoldan ayırmasın. Let God not part you from the straight path. And it's, of course, a very strong invitation to vote for that political party for the conservative masses. It's almost insinuating that that's the path of God, although it's the path of Demirel. And it's the new party of Demirel. Very convenient. And he became the ruler of that party after some caretakers had taken the initial steps of establishing and running that party until 1987. He got back into politics in 1987, was able to get about 19 or 20% of the vote. And in 1991, his vote share increased to 27%, and he became the prime minister. And in 1989, as the vote share of the Motherland Party was dropping from 45% to 36% and probably further down, it was well calculated by Özal, and he became the first elected president of the country in the Grand National Assembly by his own supporters in 1989 for a one-term, 7-year tenure. However, he could not survive the 7 years. He passed away in 1993. In his place, Demirel became the next president, again elected by his parties and also the coalition partner, SHP's voters. In the meantime, in 1993, a legal change was introduced by the Grand National Assembly, which enabled the old political parties to be established. And the Republican People's Party was established and participated in the elections in 1995 under the leadership of Deniz Baykal, who was one of the faction leaders of the former CHP. And therefore, this new CHP was just a minor image of the former one. Many argue that it's not the same CHP. Many who had served in the 1970s would not participate in the CHP because they considered this to be Deniz Baykal's CHP, not the real CHP. And this controversy continues to this day. Ecevit never accepted it. He established his own political party, Democratic Left Party. His wife was instrumental in establishing it, and the two of them ran the party more or less as a leader party. And that party became very successful in the 1999 elections and became the leading party, and he served as an ailing, elderly statesman in 1999 at the head of a coalition. And his popularity seemed to have increased simply because he was the one who more or less ended the PKK's campaign by initiating the process that resulted in the extradition of Abdullah Öcalan, the leader of the PKK, from Syria to Italy, to Greece, to Kenya, where he was abducted by the Americans, who turned Öcalan over to the Turkish government. Until his death, Ecevit had been interviewed on this matter a few times. He said he never understood why the Americans handed him to the Turkish authorities, to his government at the time. And he was tried, that is, Öcalan was tried, found guilty. In the meantime, Turkey changed its laws and banned death penalty, and he was put in prison for life and spending time in a state penitentiary on the island of İmralı in Marmara Sea for this period. And this process has been continuing about his status, where he should be, how he's supposed to be doing, with the ethnic politics in Turkey gaining new momentum after 2002 elections, with the ascent to power of Justice and Development Party, which was established in 2001. Now, in this process, the Motherland Party lost support. In its place, the True Path gained some support for a while, and also a right-wing political Islamist coalition, first with the nationalists, with MHP, or what had been established in its place, Milliyetçi Çalışma Partisi, sort of the German translation sounds better to understand what that meant, National Arbeitspartei, sort of a national toil party, so to speak, was established by Turkish, who then changed the name to MHP. Eventually, after the 1995 elections, could not win enough votes then, but it participated in the elections under the banner of the Welfare Party, in coalition with the Welfare Party, old coalition partners, in sort of an alliance for election. And the two won about 17% of the vote. Then they boosted their vote in 1995 to 21.4%. However, this time, with the plurality of the vote, of course, the RP's leader, Erbakan, had the chance to establish the government, but he wasn't able to put together a coalition government. In its place, DYP and the Motherland parties were able to negotiate a government which was also supported by the CHP, who did not participate in the election. I'm sorry, who did not participate in the coalition, in the Grand National Assembly. But this shaky coalition could not last very long when the Welfare Party tabled an interpellation against Sorun in the Grand National Assembly, against Tansu Çiller, arguing that she was immoral, corrupt, has been involved in embezzlement of funds, misuse and misappropriation of public money, and called her degrading names, hırsız, etc., in these allegations. The True Path Party leader decided that he could get away with not doing anything and letting his own group, to their own conscience, to decide on this matter. For Mesut Yılmaz and Tansu Çiller, the two leaders of these two political parties, had little love lost between the two. They were hating each other completely. And under these circumstances, the Motherland Party new leader after Özal, Mr. Yılmaz, and the True Path Party's new leader after Süleyman Demirel became the president, Ms. Tansu Çiller, had a falling apart over this interpellation. But in an unanticipated move, and not necessarily very moral, to tell you the truth, the Motherland Party pulled out of this coalition government, and the True Path Party at the same time. And the True Path Party started negotiations with the Welfare Party, and this time agreed to support the prime ministership of Erbakan after this highly damning accusations were leveled against her by the very party of Erbakan. And the two established a coalition, which obviously created a lot of qualms in the country, and many started to react to it as sort of a rather unethical or even immoral alliance of the two forces, which has been slighted in all this debate over the years and glossed over by others. This coalition came under increasing pressure from the people in the streets of the country, and the people started to react to it in increasing tones as various interest groups came together to resist it. Under these circumstances, the military jumped into the fray and put a little more pressure on a National Security Council meeting at the end of February, 28th of April 1997, which started the process that ended the coalition eventually. It looked as if the coalition was weathering too much conflict coming from too many sources, big business, military, trade unions, or whatever was of them, and also many civil society groups and the media, which they could not ignore or weather through. And it became almost impossible for the government to govern properly. So on the 18th of June, 1997, Prime Minister decided to hand in his resignation to the President. Now, it's been argued ever since, especially by the front bench of the Justice and Development Party, that Süleyman Demirel participated in this coup to oust Erbakan. And there is little love lost between Erbakan and Demirel. They hate each other also for very long periods of time. So under these circumstances, Demirel was happy to see his back as he left the party go away. And he turned to the Motherland Party's leader, Mesut Yilmaz, to establish the new government with DSP, actually. So the two, the Motherland Party and DSP, were able to establish some kind of coalition supported by those who split from the DYP. And it's been argued that the president of the country, Süleyman Demirel, played some role in convincing these people to split from DYP and support this coalition party. And it was this coalition party that more or less ended the warlike relationship between the PKK and Turkey in 1999. And Turkey fought this increasing pressure of the terror organization PKK from 1991 until 1999 with coalition governments, and successfully defeated it and ended this process in 1999. By 2000, PKK had left Turkey pretty much, and there was hardly any deaths occurring under these circumstances. And it could be argued that there was a solution presented to Turkey at that time with the capture of Öcalan under the circumstances. And the Turkish governments were not able to manage the situation properly. Had Turkey moved very quickly to stop the ban on ethnic nationalist Kurdish parties at the time, brought them into some kind of a negotiation in the Grand National Assembly, changed the constitution very fast to further liberalize Turkey and extend various freedoms to cover all, Turkey might have solved this problem under the circumstances. This has been suggested to the governments, but the coalition government at the time, under huge economic pressure, could not go through with this. And the Justice and Development Party that came to power under the circumstances could not foresee such a development and could not show the capability and political acumen to take these kinds of steps because it wasn't feeling strong enough under these circumstances. It was feeling still, at the time, with only 34% of the votes supporting them, and thanks to the 10% threshold, it was able to get a disproportionate amount of seats. It had the seats, but not necessarily the popular backing. And they were not very sure in their terms as how to engage these various nationalist forces, including the military, to convince them to make all these changes at the time. So very important time was lost, which enabled the PKK to reinvent itself and reimpose itself on the Turkish political scene all over again after 2007. And the new set of negotiations started after that first clandestinely, secretly, and then more in the open with some secrecy involved in it. So up until now, we don't know what is being negotiated and how it is negotiated, but it looks as if whatever seems to be happening, the process seems to be continuing, and process became a goal in and of itself under these circumstances. And we still don't know whether anything concrete will come out of this negotiation under these circumstances. But in the meantime, using their rapport with the Kurds, also using their religious credentials, coming as a right-wing major force in Turkish politics, as the center-right collapsed in Turkey, as the CHP got stuck on the left, and MHP, further right, failed to gain any more foothold, they were able to establish in a very large swath a highly controllable, hegemonic position to become the predominant party of the Turkish system, if Turkey is still a democracy today. Otherwise, a hegemonic one party under these circumstances. So this picture changed from party government to coalition government of 3 to 5 political parties, moderate pluralist party system, as Giovanni Sartori calls it, which continued all the way to 1999 and gave the impression that Turkey may indeed be going for something more, 5 to 7 political parties, and not so moderate, but an extreme pluralism, perhaps, more like Italy of 1970s and 80s. Then, with the introduction of Justice and Development Party, thanks to the ban of the Virtue Party, which had been established in the place of Welfare Party when it was banned by the Constitutional Court as becoming the focal point of anti-secular activities in the country. Out of the fold of the Virtue Party emerged 2 groups, the octogenarians, the elderly, led by Erbakan himself, and those who had resisted the octogenarian rule of the elderly in the former party under the leadership of Abdullah Gül, who had vied for power and lost it. And that loss was fortunate, for he was able to establish his stature in the Turkish political system to be one of the leading figures in establishing the Justice and Development Party, not the Felicity Party that the octogenarians established. So FP split into 2. So under these circumstances, RP was banned, led to Fazilet Partisi, Virtue Party, which was banned, which led to 2 political parties, Justice and Development of the young, or Young Turks, versus the older generation of the former Virtue Party politicians congregating in another organization called Felicity Party, Saadet Partisi, which is still around, but gets a very humble percentage of the vote in today's politics of Turkey. And that enabled the Turkish political system to have something like a predominant party format with relatively competitive elections, though the level of freedom and fairness can be called into question the way election rules have been manipulated and applied in the recent years. And this, therefore, turned the Turkish system back to a sort of a 1950-ish type of government-opposition relations, which, as we had discovered in the 1950s, is not sustainable. And indeed, what happened in the 1950s was almost repeated. So there is a historical repetition. Again, the party that is dominant has become increasingly authoritarian in its approach, have got involved in huge amount of corruption. As people start to react to this, they try to suppress oppression and oppress the opposition and the media and curtail back freedoms and impose censorship on all forms of media, including social media. And Turkey went back to another breakdown of democracy under the rule of Justice and Development Party by 2013. So that is where the party system seems to be standing under the circumstances. So when we look at the overall picture, we do see that Turkey has had many different kind of governments: party governments, coalition governments, coalition and minority governments, minority coalition governments. And there has been a considerable amount of oscillation between these different types of governments with changing rules of the game and changing voting behavior. So there are two factors that you need to consider here. One is the changing rules of the game, new constitution, new election law, and new Political Parties Act, which produced an outcome for more accountability in the recent years and less representativeness under these circumstances. As people started to vote more strategically for not their first choices, but second or third choices instead, for voting for their first choices does not guarantee that they will be represented in the Grand National Assembly, so they value the representation more and therefore vied for the support of major political parties and pulled back their support from smaller political parties, and that changed the party picture in Turkey considerably in the 21st century. And that produced a party government again, all over again. And the coalition governments, which had ruled the country in the 1990s and also in the 1960s and 70s, have been in this process stigmatized, delegitimized as much as possible. Of course, there are many problems with that, simply because, number one, when you compare coalition government and party government performances in the 20th century from 1950 until 1999, there is no major difference. There is no statistical difference, statistically significant difference between the performance of these two different types of government in that period, in terms of producing employment, in terms of producing economic growth, in terms of producing budget deficit or lack of it, or managing the affairs of foreign trade and managing the trade deficit. And party governments have not been able to solve these problems very effectively either. Besides, some of the coalition governments were instrumental in bringing about dramatic changes in Turkish economy and politics. Yes, it was the coalition government, for example, in 1999, which had suffered the dramatic financial meltdown of the banking system, where 19 banks out of 86 collapsed overnight. It was a big, big deal, yes, of course. But they were the same government that produced a cure for it and handed down this cure on a golden platter to the Justice and Development Party, which was able to prudently rule with those kinds of cures in its portfolio between 2002 and 2007 elections. And that helped them win the elections because of that. It was the coalition government led by Bülent Ecevit, Mesut Yılmaz and Devlet Bahçeli, who brought in Dr. Kemal Dervish from the International Bank of Reconstruction and Development, known otherwise as the World Bank, to draw up the new set of rules and regulations to clear up the financial markets in Turkey, make a deal with the IMF, make a deal with the World Bank, and establish Turkey on sound footing. And Turkey was growing by 2002. In fact, Justice and Development Party came to power in December 2002. The government sworn in December 2002. Therefore, the performance of the economy for 2002 cannot be credited to Justice and Development Party, but to the coalition. And Turkey was on a growth path by the end of 2002. And the budget had already been established by the time Justice and Development Party had come to rule the country for 2003. They followed more or less the same budget. So the performance in 2003 could also be accorded to Kemal Dervish's budget of 2002. So under these circumstances, only after 2003, the performance of the economy should be credited to Justice and Development Party management, which went fine until 2009, when Turkish economy took a nosedive under the influence of 2008 international economic recession, which many countries suffered, and so did Turkey. But Turkey was able to come out of it very fast, which is again to the credit of the Justice and Development Party, which enabled them to win more votes in 2011 because of that. So party government, thanks to the workings of the earlier coalition government, which established the infrastructure for a robust economic growth and economic reconstruction under those circumstances. It was that coalition government that was able to change the constitution on several occasions and introduce end to death penalty, ban the death penalty, which might or might not have been possible under one party of party government by Justice and Development Party. It was that coalition that changed the laws and regulations on public tender, İhale Kanunu, which was hailed as one major step in the direction of establishing Copenhagen criteria in Turkey. And it was in line with the acquis communautaire of the European Union. And that public tender law was amended tens of times, and its 113 articles were changed by the Justice and Development Party, and therefore it has no connection to acquis any longer. So was the coalition government doing the right sort of thing, or the Justice and Development Party doing the right sort of thing? Of course, that kind of change also enabled the party government under Justice and Development to distribute goodies to cronies in the rent-seeking crony capitalism of Turkey today. Without a change in that tender law, they couldn't have done it. And it's been the basic source of corruption in Turkey under these circumstances. So is the coalition government more in agreement with the Copenhagen criterion, or is it the party government more in agreement with the Copenhagen criterion? Depends on where you look at it, from which perspective. But if you read the Commission reports of the EU, if you look at the international business communities, all of them have been arguing that until 2005, when Turkey started full accession negotiations with the European Union. It was the Justice and Development Party taking all the right steps, and the previous coalition government was a mess. Well, it depends on what you take as evidence. Now they're rethinking about their position. Well, let them think so. Let me remind you some basic stuff from your previous political science courses. If you're going to establish a democracy, you have to consider that you may have hung government or hung parliament at some point in time, as the British are experiencing today, even with first-past-the-post system with single-member districts. That means coalition government. Coalition government is an inherent, spontaneous form of government of a democracy. You can't have coalition government in authoritarian or totalitarian systems. So coalition government is government of democracy. If you don't like coalition government, you have to think about whether you like democracy or not. It's a basic fact of life. There are governments, especially in Europe, that are only ruled as coalition governments. Netherlands, after the Second World War, only had coalition government, nothing else. Germany, except for 4 years, had been ruled by coalition governments. It's currently being ruled by a coalition government. 5th largest economy in the world, most important economy in Europe. So type of government in a democracy does not matter that much. Let me also remind you another matter. After the famous recession in 2008, Belgium had a great difficulty establishing its government. For 540 days, they ran without a government. While Greece, Italy, Portugal, Ireland, and Spain had collapsing economies, Belgium didn't have a collapsing economy without a government. Looking at party government and emphasizing it to this extent is not necessarily very healthy for running and understanding how a democracy should be run in this country. It's not necessarily helping the country very much. Now, in this process, especially after 1961, with the new constitution, we can see that we have gone through a very turbulent period, which is becoming less turbulent as Turkey is losing credibility as a democracy. Where we were more turbulent in the 1970s, with high volatility. For example, Freedom House was defining Turkey as totally free. Today, after 2011 elections, these are election dates, of course. The last election is 2011. In 2013, Freedom House's report says Turkey is a not free country. Read the report. This does not necessarily mean that Turkey is doing a very good and very efficient job. Effective government can be established in an authoritarian or even a totalitarian system, as Chinese are proving it to be the case. Democracy has to be defended on its own merits. And Turkey doesn't seem to be understanding the difficulty here. So the volatility in the system, where the voters change sides and political parties, reached its climax in 2002. As you can see, when the old political parties diminished, hollowing the center, and new political parties were established as the main powerhouses, especially Justice and Development Party. So there were lots of switches from these political parties to the new ones. And volatility increased to new heights, huge, 43.9%. And it's dropped down to about 9% now. Though we have something like an authoritarian system at work. It came as a price, not necessarily for the improvement of democracy. Again, fragmentation of the vote seemed to have decreased to a certain extent, where it had been much more fragmented in the Grand National Assembly as well as in the extra-parliamentary party system. And the effective number of political parties has dropped now from close to about 4 to something closer to about 3 under these circumstances. The party system has become less fragmented. Effective number of parties has become less. Establishing party government became easier. Volatility dropped, but polarization increased in the system tremendously as we have moved from one end to another, as I'll try to show you how. These are the political parties which we asked in surveys for people to place on this left-right spectrum, when 1 stands for extreme left, 10 for extreme right. 2002, CHP was 3.9 on the scale of 10, putting CHP on the left. This is in the eyes of the people. Okay? DHAP, the Kurdish Nationalist Party, was slightly to its left. Motherland Party, Justice and Development Party, True Path Party, and the MHP were around 7 and 8, MHP being on the farthest right party, in the eyes of the people. Okay? 2002 elections. In these elections, Justice and Development Party, this party, won the election to the detriment of the other two, and MHP also lost big. CHP, which had been out of government and out of parliament in 1999, also came into the system. So people voted those who might be considered as those who are left out in the 1999 to power in 2002. 2004, before the local elections, more or less the same standing of these two political parties, and all of these, again, more or less, moving closer together, closer to the center. This is the center, 5 and 6. Then, 2007 elections, CHP further left. Independents, some of them are Kurdish, of course. The Young Party, which I won't mention now. The True Path, Justice and Development, Felicity Party, and the Nationalist Action Party, again, between 7 and 8. In this order, with MHP being put on the farthest right by a sliver, not big. Then 2011, Republican People's Party is 2.2, almost communist. Far left out there. BDP 3.4, more or less protecting its position. And then look at where Justice and Development and MHP are. They're no longer in the 7 territory, they're 8. Look how big this gap is between the two. They're poles apart, and Turkey has become highly polarized, where ideologically completely different realms seem to have come about. And the left-right scale, if you look at the left-right scale, where people put themselves, not the parties, this is the spread. On the left, you have somewhere around 15 to 12, 20% of the vote. Okay? Put these two together, 12, 17, 21, or something like that. So 20, 21% here. In the center, about 22%. 55% place themselves on the right. You see? There was a big shift to the right in Turkey. And with that shift, the political parties on the right are getting an easy time of collecting votes. As I'll try to show you from the past, in 1990, for example, 22% had placed themselves on the left again. Almost same percentage. And as you can see, there's not much action here. They're all down here. Small waves. Look at the waves over there. 22.7% had placed themselves in 1990 on the right. Now that percentage by 2007 had gone up to 47%. 2011, 55%. Heaven of right-wingers. Yes, ma'am.
But maybe I got it wrong, but wasn't it always the case that the center-right has always been the majority, like with the DP?
That's behavior, though, not ideology. People were here in the middle voting for political parties here. They were in 5 and 6 voting for parties on 7. Now you have about 20% of the people placing themselves on the far right in Turkey. Not in the past, not 20 years ago. Not until 1990 have we reported ever in any of our surveys that were conducted in 70s, 80s, or in 1990. It all changed with 1995. Turkey had a critical realignment of the voter in 1995, end of Cold War, beginning of post-Cold War era, where religion and ethnicity became so more important than anything else that mattered in society. And with that, we had a big shift of people going right-wing and thinking of themselves as right-wing, placing themselves on the right. Now they're ideologically on the right. They're not only voting for political parties on the moderate right, but they also are themselves on the right. At the same time, parties on the moderate right are gone. They're no longer around.
I'm not sure that in France when you say I'm on the right, I know what it means, but in Turkey, what does it really mean? Like,
I don't know. You should ask the people. We tell the people this is it. We hear people talking about right and left in this country. If that makes any sense to you, and 85 to 95% of our respondents say yes, it does. Could you place yourself on the scale where 1 stands for extreme left, 10 stands for extreme right? And they automatically say, here I am, without any difficulty or thinking. To the point. What does this mean? I don't know. I don't care. Because they put themselves on the scale just like this, just like the way you see it on this distribution. And they put the parties on the scale as they are. And when I match the two, I have an immaculate correlation. What more do I need? This is what Anthony Downs told us to believe in. People vote for political parties that are ideologically akin to them, close by. People are where these political parties are. If people move here, suddenly you can see new political parties developing. More liberal parties coming up, for example. Today, they have no chance in Turkey because there are no liberals in Turkey, or almost none. Very little. Liberal would be a position, say, of, say, 6 or 7. Well, look at the percentages there. As opposed to these people. Approximately 40% of the people are here. You have another 15% or so in this little slot there. And with 10% barrage, would you vote for a liberal party? Let's vote down the drain. Lift 10% vote, it's a totally different ballgame. So election laws matter. So does behavior. Voting behavior. Voting behavior changes in spite of the fact that the election rules are the same as it did from 1983 up until 2011. They kept changing depending on the circumstances, the way the economy goes, the way we think of ourselves ideologically, etc. We have completely different outcomes. We have coalition governments, we have party governments coming out of the same election laws. Why? Because people voted differently. They changed their calculations, their positions, their ideology, their way of thinking, their mentality, moved from one end to the other, and as a result of which, we had a new ball game and a different political party system developing in Turkey.
What do you think caused the shift from the right?
Well, in the rising tide of conservatism in Turkey, in the book, we have discussed this a little bit. Several factors. One, the left was completely battered by the military rule from 1980 until 1995. Also, by the collapse of Soviet Union, as all left got into a crisis, not only in Turkey, but throughout the world as the Soviet Union collapsed. As less and less people thought that socialist ideas are workable ideas, don't make any sense. Then, in this process, the civil society organizations of Turkey, in the form of trade unions, were also completely decimated as well. Now, in the past, Turkey had about 1/4 of the working force in Turkey unionized. Now that is down to single digit, about 8%. Doesn't exist. Flexible market circumstances. We are boasting with it, which enables us to have rapid growth. You can fire and hire people a lot easier today than you can every time before. But, of course, without any strong union movement in Turkey, getting the social democratic parties organized and running is very difficult. Mind you that in Europe, these two go hand in hand, for example. Think about TUC and the Labour Party. Although they've had their differences in the recent times, TUC was the organization that established the Labour Party in the first place. Social Democrats in Germany, or socialists in France, or Italy, for that matter, have a strong backing from these class-based organizations. Turkey had neither the kind of class consciousness of the left, nor the organizations around from 1980s onwards. So these frailties converted themselves into these dismal situations. This looks as the left is stuck in Turkey. It's not a major force to be reckoned with. And if a political party is considered to be here, it has a very, very difficult job. You have only about 6% of the people at this spot.
Isn't the CHP considered to be
That's the difficulty of CHP. How do you repackage yourself so that the voters can come to you as they had moved all the way here and your party is here and perceive this? The gap is huge. And whatever CHP does, it gets to lose. It's condemned by the left-wingers as it tries to move this way, and it has to move dramatically. It's not like the European situation where you have a bimodal distribution of a left and right, more or less similar, and the competition is centripetal. It is not so. There is a strong party or two that control the vote over there, where more than 50% of the people are. And then you have small political parties here not necessarily getting anywhere. So under these circumstances, the position of the CHP is very, very difficult. It's getting some vote from the center who are alarmed by these differences, by these changes that has been occurring and this movement for extreme right wing in Turkish politics. And that is defining the kind of momentum between political parties and the competition continuing between them under these circumstances, which has not been centripetal, therefore increasing polarization. This is now competing to the center, but these political parties are not. The vote happens to be where AKP is. And I have argued on many occasions over time in academic as well as non-academic meetings that if AKP does nothing, no campaigning, nothing, it'll get about 35% of the vote, which is much more than CHP can get at any election. The circumstances do not look like balanced under these circumstances. And it creates a proclivity for predominance. And that is why Justice and Development Party is emerging as a predominant party and growing into becoming an hegemon. And not feeling this competition very much, it's developing an authoritarian flair. And that is undermining the weak establishment of Turkish democracy anyway. And that seems to be the big problem facing Turkey today. Any further questions? Good. Let me turn to the next aspect of this problem of non-political organizations, the organization of interest, and pressure groups in Turkey, which seem to be moving hand in hand with what I had shown you earlier. Now, there are several different types of organizations in Turkey. And the officials keep a tally of this. And you can get this from www.dernekler.gov.tr. So our government keeps a tally of these organizations. They have to be registered. These are voluntary organizations. Number one among them are sports organizations. 163,000 of them, I'm sorry, 16,384 of them, I'm very sorry, 16,384 of them exist. They are the most number of organizations in Turkey by a whisker, followed by religious organizations, 16,121. Then charitable organizations, yardımlaşma örgüt dernekleri. 15,353 of them. Okay? Then come the development organizations, kalkınma dernekleri. You know, as you go through Istanbul, if you look up, you'll see the signs of these dernekler. Çamlıhenşini Kalkındırma Derneği. Sivas Zara Yardımlaşma Derneği. The placards are everywhere. As you walk through the city, you can see them. Okay? Then there is professional solidarity associations. 9,000 or so. Then there's something called social life organizations, according to our government. Then there are friendship organizations, whatever they mean. Culture, health. Then there is, of course, reconstruction, probably cooperatives. There are a few, 1,718 ecological organizations, social organizations, as opposed to social life organizations. There are civil rights organizations, 863 of them. Youth organizations, 810 of them. Then there is charitable organization, hayır işleri, another form of yardımlaşma, 664 of them. There are student organizations, 335, and there are international organizations, 76 of them. That is the picture. What puts these organizations together? What runs them? Well, number one factor in establishing some kind of solidarity, partnership, and sustain it has been blood-based. Relatives, lineage, or in the east and southeast, tribes, ashiret, which is the largest family you can get, all 10,000 of them. Of course, when it's that big, you know, it's very difficult to know everyone in that organization. There is, according to psychologists, 150 rules. You know, you can't sustain, as a human being, relations with 150 people, no more. So the social media is problematic. If it's global and you belong to a network and you're communicating with 85 million people, you can't handle it. That's what psychologists tell us. As a social animal, you can only keep a tally of 150 names at any point in time. So villages are usually about 150 adults. It's something like 300, 400 people living together, 150 adults who know each other at any point in time, for example. So blood ties could mean a nuclear family, extended family, a lineage group of many relatives, your uncles, aunts, which of course have different names in Turkish. You call a dayı an uncle in English, or an amca an uncle in English, although they mean completely different things. Amca is your father's brother, whereas dayı, another uncle, is your mother's brother. And there are completely two different characters, especially in Turkish society. This role of brother-in-law in Turkey, kayınbirader, is very specific. Now, you're too young to know this, but we used to have a very successful comedian, Orhan Boran, who used to have a radio show, ancient time I'm talking about, when I was your age, not now. And one of the major characters in this radio talk show was the kayınbirader, who was wreaking havoc in the life of this man all the time. Irresponsible, not focused, Give him any errand to run, he'll make a mockery of it. So dayı is a different sort of a character. Dayı also, as a sister around, sisters have a soft spot for their siblings. They come around to eat the cookery of the sister, goes in and out very easily, etc. Not the same sort of relationship with your between two men in the family, brothers. So it's a different story. So lineage is very important in Turkey. And much depends on it, on this kind of relationship. Many organizations are established on the spaces, and also Turkey has a plenitude of family firms. And they are run better. And partnerships are very, very hard to sustain and move in life, especially if they're not within the lineage group. But even these are not problem-free. We have difficulty getting along with each other in the families also. Many families have a lot of stories about double-crossers, those who take some loans never pay back. There's murder in the family many times, you know, especially between husband and wife. You hear so often. There was at least one woman killed every other day last November, the Turkish press reported in Turkey. This is after a new law, which shows you how meticulously laws have been enforced at the same time. So under these circumstances, this is one way of establishing some kind of relationship. If you're going to establish a partnership, this is one sort. Another sort, which you see here, for example, the second category, third category, hayır işleri, etc., religion. That comes in the form of tariqat, usually brotherhoods, which are not always legal, but they exist. Very important. Absorbs a lot of energy and support, and creates a basis for solidarity. Third, territorial solidarity, which we call hemşeri. Actually, correctly put, it's hemşehri, which is a Farsi word, not a Turkish word, which means from the same settlement. In Turkish, this may mean anything. It may mean from the same village, same town, same city, same province, same region, you know. One guy may be from Niğde, another from Kayseri, which are both central Anatolia. They may call each other hemşeri, although they're not. They don't come from the same background. So it's very flexible. And we have many of these. Kalkınma, dayanışma. These two kinds of voluntary associations are basically Sivaslılar Yardımlaşma Derneği, or could be Kayseriler Dayanışma Derneği, or could be any province, or any sub-province, ilçe, small town, village, anywhere. That's the third sort, basically. Now these three basic sorts define all of this. They're primordial, in essence, and they operate in an environment that is not very conducive to establishing any kind of partnership and sustaining it. Now, if you look at the surveys that we've been conducting for the last 20 years, these are some representative data from that. Approximately 7% of the people have been reporting in the last 20 years or so, 25 years, that they are dues-paying, card-carrying members of voluntary associations. 7%. There's 2.5% error. Make you happy, 10%. Add that 2.5% on 7.4%. 90% of the people in Turkey do not belong to any voluntary associations by their own account. Although they seem to be underrepresenting themselves, we observe that more people report that they belong to a political party. Among the voluntary associations, the most popular are the parties. Least popular, environmental associations. Although, as I showed you, there are a few, but very few people are members to it. Probably there are multiple membership by single individuals. So one group of people are over-associational, whereas huge majority have nothing to do with voluntary associations. Associational life almost does not exist in Turkey. And running partnerships is also very difficult. If you look at it in comparative perspective, number of citizens per voluntary association is not that low in Turkey. You know, it's 429 in Canada, 434 in the United Kingdom. US is doing very well, 172 people per association. It's 543 in Turkey. Not too bad, you know, when you make this kind of comparison. These are number of people per association, per voluntary association, above the age of 18. So there are many more associations in a country such as the United States to make that 172. And in fact, associational life is highly developed in the United States. And this has been reported by such people as Alexis de Tocqueville 250 years ago. So it's nothing new. It's been a strong part of it in comparison to that. As you can see in Turkey, the most important difficulty in establishing and running these associations is basic traits of culture, which define social capital. There is very little social capital in Turkey, although it seems to be increasing recently. It does not hard enough, deep enough to sustain associational activity. First of all, in surveys we ask 3 questions to determine interpersonal trust. Do you think, in general, most people can be trusted? Or you cannot be too careful in dealing with people? In 2006, when we asked this question, third or the fourth time, approximately, this is a 11-point scale, 5 being in the middle. Those who showed distrust in people were 77%. 3/4 of the people said you can't be trusting others. See someone approaching you on the street, change the pavement. Go to another curb. Never trust people. Don't turn your back to them. In 2013, when we asked the same question, that had dropped to 59%. And the average improved from 2 to close to 4. Which means there's some more of it, but not much more. And when we compare that with, say, thin interpersonal trust in Turkey with, say, Latin American countries, Mexico, Chile, Brazil, or Latin European countries such as Portugal, Spain, and Italy, and a West European democracy such as Britain, Turkish percentages are closer to Latin America, lowest being Brazil on the list, but almost half of Britain, for example. It seems to indicate that with so much lack of interpersonal trust, it's very difficult to establish in the first place and sustain partnerships or associations and work in associations. 2 other questions I said. In general, are people inclined to take care of themselves only, or are they inclined to help others? Again, 57% think that people are egoists in this country. Arithmetic mean is 4, or 3.9, close to 4. On the negative side, with 2.6 standard deviation, so it's around sort of middle-ish. Okay, and are most people inclined to take advantage of others, or are they inclined to be fair in their social relations? 56% said in 2013 again that people are likely to take advantage of others. So be very careful. And only a small percentage said, 25% said that people are fair in their dealings with others. That's the divide. And this, of course, does not necessarily translate into trust or confidence in institutions as well. We tend to trust fellow citizens more than any individual. When you ask the question as a stranger, any individual, could be anybody. But if you say fellow citizens or acquaintances, now then percentages increase. Not tremendously, but have not been very, very low in comparison to other responses. Of course, 0 means we don't trust in fellow citizens. 10, we trust them very much. Acquaintances, we trust them greatly. Approximately 1 out of 5 people say that they trust their acquaintances. Religious institutions get to be trusted a lot also. As you can see here, 1 out of 5 trust very highly. 1 out of 6 relatively highly religious institutions. Courts. The first line is for 2007. Second line from 2013. As you can see, we didn't seem to have too much of distrust for the courts in 2007, but distrust is now increasing rapidly. The least amount of trust, 0, increased from about 6 to 10. 3 to 6, 3 to 9, almost 4 to 7, 4 to 6. As you can see, it is on the increase. Our trust in courts seem to be dropping. And there's good reason for that, because the courts are becoming less and less trustworthy in their behavior anyway. Public bureaucrats, we don't trust them much. Turkish Grand National Assembly. In 2007, those who didn't trust them at all was 20%. That dropped to 10%. So our trust in the Grand National Assembly seemed to be improving slightly. And this dropped from about 8% to 5%, 9% to 8%, 8% to 7%, 7% to 6%. So in the middle, you have about 1/5. Now we have about 1/6 of the people. So it looks as if trust in the Grand National Assembly seems to have improved. And that probably correlates with the kind of attitude we have towards the government party. However, trust in government seem to have been doing not as well as the trust in the Grand National Assembly. This trust seemed to have improved in some categories, but dropped in the least trusted category from 14% to 11%. But the standard deviation is, again, 2.5 to 2.7, so there's a lot of overlap, and that's not much of a change. Government is not trusted that much. And in 2007, 1 out of 5 people had full trust in government. Now that is down to about 13%. 1 out of 8. Now what is alarming is that we trust the police a lot. And that's amazing. Look at these categories here. 1 out of 4 people trusted the police fully, 100%. Now that's 1 out of 6. And these categories, if you put them together, they're way over 50%. Armed forces was much more trusted than the police. That trust is waning, getting less, but still higher than the police. Approximately 50%, half the people said they fully trusted the military in 2007. That number is down to about 30% now. That was a big drop after a lot of accusations of wrongdoing, propensity for coup, etc. And there was a lot of prestige by the military. But still, they are the most popularly trusted institution in Turkey. President, this is in 2007, Ahmet Necdet Sezer, fully trusted by 1/3 of the people. And again, very relatively high level of trust. European Union, 1/4 didn't trust an iota in the European Union. And this trust is again very high. Trust is very low, as you can see. Not much confidence in the European Union. We need to trust the newspapers, although our overall trust for them seemed to have improved from 2007 to 2013. And private networks, we also have very little trust as of 2007. So not only interpersonal trust, but also institutional trust do not seem to be supportive of, especially democratic form of government very much, as you can see. Police get supported, military gets supported, not to the extent way beyond the National Assembly, who we elect, or the courts, for that matter, under these circumstances. And this is a little more difficult to keep track of, but these are social tolerance measures. When we ask people, who would you not like as neighbor? Turkish figures, I can see it better here, which you can't, are these, way up above here, surpassed by South Korea and Saudi Arabia, when we make the comparisons. They dislike neighbors more than Turks. But in the case of Turkish population, it looks as if most population tend to dislike a lot of people who are not like them, which is, of course, an alarming problem. For example, Turkish dislike for Jews is the highest in this list in comparison to all these countries, and way above South Korea's, although South Korea surpasses Turkey on most of their accounts. Unstable people, or Christians. In the case of Christians, South Koreans seem to be less fond of Christians than Turks, in general. Foreign workers, again, not very fond of foreign workers in this case, as you can easily see. People with AIDS, homosexuals, drug addicts. It looks as if, you know, any dissenting type of character, socially unfit, becomes automatically stigmatized and would like to be kept at arm's length. Social tolerance seems to be considerably low in Turkey.
What about the trust in the businesses?
Sorry?
What about the trust in the businesses?
In business? Well, this previous picture, as you can see, we had business firms in earlier surveys, not us in these surveys in 2006 and 2007, but big business was the least trusted of all categories, and almost the same level as political parties and newspapers, awfully. Low on interpersonal trust, although improving. Low on social tolerance. Low on associability. And high on primordialism. Turkish civil society seems to be operating on a very thin sheet of ice. And it doesn't look as if it is robust enough to hold the society on a vibrant, participatory, liberal, democratic path in and of itself. And that seems to be one of the biggest weaknesses of Turkish political culture, which Turkey has not been able to overcome under these current circumstances in Turkey.